just an introduction?
Yep, right to the one.
Okay. My name is Corbett Harrison. This is my 20th year of teaching. I just taught a class of 7th graders.
I'm sorry. It looks like that mute switch is still on there.
You're right, it is.
Oh, there we go.
My fault.
Vacuum sound that was, okay. One more time.
Okay. My name is Corbett Harrison. I've been teaching for 23 years. I teach language arts and English, and I just was working with my 7th grade students on a lesson about poetry.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to read these questions sort of robotically because they're the same every time for everyone, so
That's
forgive
good.
me for that. All right, here we go. We want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. So how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it? Discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson.
My students start with poetry, and then about February we come back to poetry. We start with poetry because it's a great place to find interesting vocabulary words, which is a big part of my regular routine. I want my students to always be looking, not just going over vocabulary words and not wondering what they mean. I want them to stop and say, I wonder what that one means. I think that's a skill a lot of students don't have. In February, about Valentine's Day, I start bringing poetry back. Mainly because we end the quarter with a critical analysis essay in 7th grade. They're going to be reading Steinbeck, they're going to read hard text, and I need them to be able to say smart things about the writer's style and the elements of writing that he focuses on. Today's lesson was about tone because that's one thing that it's easy for the students to discover in John Steinbeck, but it was also a review of good literature, has good vocabulary in it, and I wanted the kids to see that and then some more Emily Dickinson poems.
Excellent. Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of texts designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, please give examples of other texts that form this sequence.
Okay. We do, when I heard text complexity with Common Core standards, I just immediately went to all the high school poets I used to teach. We've done Sylvia Plath, we've done Emily Dickinson, we've done Robert Frost, we've done E.A. Robinson at this point, so harder poets. They enjoy Emily Dickinson. We sang Emily Dickinson today, which is one of their favorite things to do, even though it's a somber mood. It's kind of a fun way to look at the poems. That was really my reason for choosing Emily Dickinson today. But the very first poem we did was her Railway Train poem, which has really hard vocabulary words in it, some that they would need to know in the future and some that they wouldn't. And we're now kind of looking at Emily Dickinson poems that are difficult vocabulary-wise, but not so much because of archaic old words that we don't use anymore, but more of the descriptions that she's using, which is kind of what John Steinbeck does as well. He uses good vocabulary words that we still have in use today, but he also uses just a lot of really unique descriptions to get his point across, and that's what I need my kids to be able to read this last novel that we'll start the last quarter with the capability of doing. Looking at vocabulary, seeing how the vocabulary may help the author to say things, convey ideas in certain ways, but also discover that thing called tone back behind the writer's big ideas.
All right. So let's see. Let's talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
I'm a consolidator. When Common Core, it's 23 years in education, I've been through several sets of standards now that our state has adopted. And when Common Core came around a couple years ago, I said, you know what, I have routines that already built in place. If I start consolidating some of these standards that I know I'm not doing as good a job with, then I can teach multiple standards at once. Today what you saw me do was we were working on reading literature, that whole strand of standards. We didn't get to the writing piece. We often run out of time for the writing challenge. We'll pick that up next time. I was going to have them write their own impersonation of Emily Dickinson's poem. But we also, you'll notice I slipped in some grammar instruction and some vocabulary instruction, which is all part of that language strand of Common Core. And I don't just teach one standard at once. I always try to figure out a way to get a second or a third one in there as well. So, there's a lot of standards to get through. And when I used to be a standards trainer myself, that was the big complaint. There's too many standards. And so I tried to show teachers how you can consolidate and teach multiple things at the same time. It only took us 3 or 4 minutes to review that grammatical concept in the middle of my lesson based on the first lines of both of those poems. That was good review for them. It made them think about language, made them reread the first line of the poem several times so they were ready to interact with the poem. But I consolidated grammar and language right there with the poetry, the text that they were having to read, the fictional text. And that's how I really do try to plan all of my lessons so that multiple standards are being addressed simultaneously.
Excellent. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies, and why?
I've got obviously the complexity of text standard, or the high quality of text standard indicator that they talk about. I'm purposely choosing much harder things than I've ever had for them to read before. We're getting to Steinbeck. We're doing Emily Dickinson today. I can't think of higher quality texts than that. The students are reading nonfiction at the same time, and they're reading high quality nonfiction. As far as use of language, I might need to look at my notes. What's that one called? That's how I call it the language standard. As far as trying to, I'll pause. As far as the second indicator, which is directing questions at them that are both text specific and text independent and dependent. Ugh, I blew it again. All right, I'll say it one more time. As far as the second indicator, which is questions that are dependent on the text and interdependent on the text. Am I saying that wrong again? Independent, not interdependent. Sorry. All right. The second indicator, which are the questions that you pose to students that are dependent on the text to be able to answer, or that they can answer independently. I tried to make those about every topic possible. What does a specific word mean? What is the specific grammar being used? What is the big idea being presented here? Which, whenever we talk about any literature, I really do try to hit all three of those levels: the grammar or structure, the vocabulary, and the big idea or theme. And then student engagement, that third indicator. After 23 years, you just have a lot of tricks to where you do less talking and the students do more talking. I've got some new strategies where they're always having to be in groups with different people so they can hear one another's opinions. Late in the year, we're 3/4 of the way through the year. They're very comfortable talking to the same people, and I've been working on some new strategies to make them sit with different folks, which you may have seen them with those exit cards that they were filling out. Those are group sorting cards so that they're hearing other people's opinions. As far as which one was the strongest, I really don't think a lot about the student engagement anymore. I think at a certain point, it kind of becomes innate. 23 years, I know how to keep them engaged. I know how to keep them on task and monitoring. The hard one for me, but the one I think I put the most work in, is designing those questions, that second indicator, so that there's the 3 levels, a grammatical level, a vocabulary or word-based level, and then a big idea level. That's probably my indicator of success of the 3 that we have, that I think I'm doing the most unique, new stuff for me as a teacher.
All right. We are interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay. Well, obviously, we're asked to be introducing them to harder texts, to more nonfiction. You didn't see them reading nonfiction today, but they were reading nonfiction. They're reading nonfiction as their homework right now. They're all in a nonfiction book. The complexity as I said in the previous answer, it's very easy for me to find texts that are more complex for them. I think I'm going to have you read the question again.
Sure, not a problem. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay, I think Common Core Standards are asking us to teach higher level texts. I think they're asking us to do a whole lot less sit and get, I used to call it, where I lecture, you listen and take notes. I want my lessons, my 70 minutes with my students to be them feeling like they're in charge, not me feeling like I'm the one in charge and giving all the learning. I want them to unpack the learning. I think today's lesson kind of illustrated how much responsibility I put in the students' hands. And it's fairly easy for me to keep the student engagement going as I walk around and I monitor the discussions and throw them prompts if I see them off topic a little bit or need a little hint on where to go. The shift, the rigor is, it's not a hard thing to be more rigorous. The hard thing I've felt with Common Core is to be rigorous and find ways to let the students be in control. And that's a shift that it's taken me a couple of years to get good at. It took some practice, but I really do give them challenging things to think and talk about that 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, I never would have asked my 7th graders to try to go that deep with a poem on this topic or go that direction with an area of grammar or take a word and really think about a vocabulary word on a certain level. The rigor is the shift that it shouldn't be hard, but you do have to figure out how to kind of change your style of engagement with students so that your rigor doesn't just leave them like deer in headlights. They're just shocked and have no idea how to answer. You've got to slowly train them to get to a point where you can throw a rigorous question at them and they'll think about it a second, but then they'll realize, okay, we can talk our way through this. We can figure this out because we've got enough clues here in what he's given us.
Excellent. So how did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
I believe both these poems used to be in our textbook when I was teaching high school, and I would assign the poem. I'd tell them what the vocabulary used to mean, and then we'd answer the questions at the end of the chapter. And today it was more about them making the discoveries, them convincing themselves that they could discover what this poem means on at least a comprehension level, and then with a couple of prompts they could take it to the thematic level. The questions in the back of the textbook used to be probably application at highest on Bloom's taxonomy, but most of them were just show me that you understood what the poem was about. And that's old Mr. Harrison. New Mr. Harrison really makes them play detective. I call them dictionary detectives when they're in the dictionary. I call them poetry detectives when they're in a poem or in a story. Figure something out that's big and not obvious, and didn't used to be that way. It used to be me telling them a lot of information, them nodding along, yes, we understand, and now we can answer these questions at the end of the chapter on a pretty low level basis. And I don't do that anymore. Now it's you figure it out and be ready to explain to me at least that you thought and discussed this poem on a deeper level.
Student engagement is critical to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensure that all students have the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. So how did you or do you support all students in working with grade level text? Do you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read a grade level text? And how do you create opportunities for advanced students to more deeply engage?
I do. Today we were all looking at the same text, and it was difficult text, and that's why they were in small groups. That's how I tried to design difficult text. And even though I randomly sorted them, I knew there'd be 1 or 2 people in each group who could, if the group kind of went for the wrong interpretation, could guide the group back. And that's how I use grouping. My students, probably 90% of them are interpersonal learners. They want to talk about it while they're learning it. That helps them. At the same time, they're interpersonal, but they like to talk on tangents. I had one period today that you didn't film that made the entire poem a vampire story, and I had to say, no, that's not what the poem is. Bring it back to what the poem actually is. And you have to monitor that. As far as students with more difficult reading levels, we read independent books, chosen books as well as assigned books in here, and we're coming up on Steinbeck, and I do have 2 different levels of Steinbeck books that I'll assign them when it's an assignment. As far as nonfiction, they were all supposed to find a nonfiction book on their own that they could comprehend and find vocabulary words in, and they had to bring it to me for approval. And so I have every student in my 7th grade classes right now are reading totally different nonfiction that they went and found on their own. And a lot of them, the students who I know would struggle choosing a good book, I made sure that they could choose books that were a little more at their grade level or at their reading level. And if I saw that there was a mismatch, then I kind of pushed them towards another book or another suggestion for books. My kids are all pretty good readers, though, and so that's not a big issue. It's the writing where I have to differentiate a little bit more than the reading. They're not all good writers, but they are all good readers for the most part, at least on the comprehension level. But if it's a hard text, we do it as a group or in partnerships, and if it's an individual text, then they make choices of a level that would be challenging to them, and then I get to approve those choices.
All right, that's a good answer. How you feeling so far? We have about 3 or 4 more left.
Get a splash of water.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are pretty informative answers.
Okay.
All right. So how do you know students were able to successfully respond to text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson? What do you do for students who did not acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson?
Today's lesson, I didn't get the chance to hear from every single student on their interpretation. I tried to get around and listen and encourage those who did not seem to be participating to throw their 2 cents in and kind of see how that 2 cents fit in with how the group was discussing. I've now forgotten your question with my little exposition that I was trying to give you there.
How do you know that students were able to successfully respond to text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson? What do you do for students who did not acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson?
This was, sorry.
Oh, no.
Pause. Okay. This was an introductory lesson to tone. We've just added voice as one of our writing traits here for the 2nd semester. And tone, introducing it, kids understand attitude, but they don't understand how you do it with writing, how you convey a tone, especially about something big like a theme. And so today was practice. Ultimately, they'll be pulling themes not only out of the nonfiction that they're reading right now, they'll pull themes out of other poems probably that are a little simpler to comprehend than these, and not just the themes, but then be able to address the tone qualities. They will also have to add tone to the writing that they're doing. We'll do a couple of small activities where they do some writing, and I expect an attitude to come forward based on their own word choices, based on their own style of describing things. But an introductory lesson on something as abstract and undefinable as voice in writing, which is what tone is a part of. It's a lot of play with the idea first before we actually get into a point where I'm going to assess them. Ultimately, my students all get assessed with a piece of writing that we're going to be doing, and they're going to have to absolutely, in their final essay for me this year, they're going to absolutely have to really talk about the tone that they're picking up in Steinbeck's writing. And Emily Dickinson was just the first step. We'll have several other poems or pieces of prose that the students will look at where they're going to do the same activity. They're going to say, okay, so what is this author trying to say based on the way that it was presented here?
All right. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson?
I better.
And what actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen? Core Action 3.
I'm on it. Say the question again.
Sure. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? What actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
Well, I think my best example is my students have become really good at listening to each other's thinking with cues from me. They still forget occasionally. With cues from me, they remember to occasionally invite their group members in who aren't saying nearly as much. I've really tried to develop a rapport between my students where everyone's opinion is valid. If I ask a question, everyone in the group should share an answer or equally participate. There are no draggers in our group, someone who is just kind of along for the ride. Everyone has learned at this point of the year that if you're in a group, if you're talking about a topic, everyone has to participate. That little trick I did at the end where I just randomly called on one person in the group who had to speak for the group, I often call on the person who seems to have been speaking the least in that period. And if they can answer fully, I invite one of their other group members to, okay, but we also said this, anything that was left out. And that's all good scaffolding to make sure that all students, if you call on them, they can kind of put to voice the complicated answer that I'm asking them to think about. And today's questions were pretty complicated. What is the tone? Never says it directly. That's a hard topic for 7th graders to, but that's why we saved that topic for the end of the year. So, but I think as far as which element of that third indicator, I think the students have gotten really good at making sure that everyone's opinion is heard before an answer is really solidified as a group. Beginning of the year, here's what you would have seen. One kid would have said, here's the answer that he wants. Everyone would have nodded along, and then it would have all twiddled their thumbs until got called on. If you watch closely, I don't think you saw very much of that today at all. Everyone was involved for the entire time that I was asking them to talk to each other.
All right.
I hope that's what the video shows anyway.
That was good. I mean, it was a good lesson. I do appreciate you also engaging everybody and walking around, and it makes it easier for us when we're watching the final. Be like, okay, you'd see each group separately, and it was good. All right, so reflecting on the lesson, what do you think worked particularly well with what do you think worked particularly well, and what might you do differently?
I know this question because I read it. It's the one I couldn't practice very much on because I didn't know how the lesson was going to go, so give me a second. What went well? What would I do differently? I just adore my students. The fact that they're at a point, at this point in 7th grade, where they can talk about something as sophisticated as this, for the most part, without giggling, without saying, okay, this is a pretty serious topic, let's have a serious opinion about it. My students are great at that, and so the 2 poems that I chose today, I knew we'd have fun with, even though they were ominous topics in front of them. And so I think the best part of the lesson was how they really did try to understand what the poet was trying to say. The fact that not enough of them saw that the tones are really quite different in the 2 poems means I still have a little bit of work to do. I did feel a little rushed there at the end, and that's fair. 70 minutes in a block schedule goes by so quickly, and I just keep having to relearn that, but there's absolutely no reason why we can't go back to these poems later on. So if I had a chance to do it again, I would probably just do one of the poems, put it away, bring another one out, and have the second discussion on another day. That's kind of always been one of my faults as a teacher, is I put a little too much planning into a 70-minute period. I was really hoping to get them to a point today where they could try to imitate Emily Dickinson's rhythm style with a stanza of their own. I want them to pay attention to things like structure in language, especially as we get to John Steinbeck, who's very structural with his language. And Emily Dickinson is a good place to practice with that. But we didn't have time for that, but that's what Wednesday's for, I suppose. We can always come back to this now.
All right.
I guess that's what I want to say.
That's good. And then the last question is, were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
with 7th graders, with poems this heavy in topic and theme, I used to be the teacher who, no matter what a student would say, I would say, yes, that is a good answer. And even though sometimes, no, that wasn't a very good answer, that was a shallow answer, or that was a totally off base answer, there were a few interpretations today that I think weren't directly on the money. They had some interesting reasons for those interpretations, so I let them justify them. I know they're going to see both of these poems again in high school, so I'm not too terribly worried that if today they didn't get the exact meaning of what Emily Dickinson was saying with either poem, they're going to get an opportunity to see this again and again, probably. These are well-known enough poems that this was a nice practice session. The goal here being today, let's try something hard, let's prove that we can do something hard, so that when I pass out the John Steinbeck books and they look at the first paragraphs, they will say, okay, this is tough, but I know now how to decipher and I know how to read into this without getting bogged down by the heaviness of the language. Emily Dickinson has nice, heavy, dense language at times, and so it was good practice for that. I think the original question was what?
Oh, just any student reaction or any surprises?
Like I said, it's with 7th graders, you don't want to tell them that's a wrong interpretation. Poetry is about interpretation, and I'll say it again. Then the class right before then, they were convinced it was a story about vampires, and you do have to say no, that is an incorrect interpretation. But if it's just slightly off, if they say something that's not perfectly matched to the way that you know how to interpret the poem, you let it go as long as they at this point can kind of use text evidence to support where they come up with that idea from. I think that's important to the process where they're allowed to get their hands dirty, and it's okay that they leave the class messy, not necessarily everything straight and neat. Their ideas in their heads can still be a little messy at this point, as long as they're really trying the skill, which is going back in and trying to prove through evidence, no, this is what she's saying or he's saying because of this word or because of this phrase.
All right. That's it. Great job.
Woohoo!